So it's been 2014 since DRASA had to be a part of Nigeria's fight to control and maybe control a future recurrence of the Ebola epidemic. Speak to me on how the fight has been so far.
It's been challenging. We're not where we need to be as a country. Our level of preparedness is not consistent. As I'm sure you can remember, in 2014, people were washing their hands consistently, using hand sanitizer. People were aware of the states of hygiene and sanitation in their communities. But now we've relaxed. We've forgotten about Ebola. We've forgotten about the risk. And many people are not even aware of what's happening in DRC and the risk that that poses to our country.
Talking about us relaxing as a nation brings to mind the fact that when you go to the airports, the checks obviously are not as stringent as they used to be. We used to have them check your temperatures and all that. We don't see that as consistently as we used to. Even the land borders, like you said, and we had this pre-chart prior to coming on air, they're so porous. It looks like the conversations have become lax over the past few years when you compare the fight inside Africa to NGOs across the world, Europe, talking about the Ebola epidemic.
Yeah, that's correct. I think on the continent we've relaxed, whereas outside the continent everyone is panicking because they know that in 2014 Ebola ended up in Scotland, in Texas, so they understand that, you know, in the Western world, if there's an Ebola outbreak on our continent, it can affect them as well. So I think they're prioritizing it more than we are, sadly.
Shall we take a moment to talk about what measures they are actually utilizing as regards their prioritizing efforts to ensure that Ebola does not return to these countries? And are there ways that Africa can learn lessons from them?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is research. They've done so much research. Merck, the pharmaceutical company, has now developed a vaccine which is being used in DRC presently. I think, you know, Ebola has been in DRC. This is now the 10th outbreak that they've had. By far the largest and the first ever in a conflict zone. But it's a shame that an international company had to be the one to develop that vaccine when it's been on our continent for decades.
So now body counts from the incursion of Ebola are nearing as high as 2,000, leading charity organizations like yourself to ask for efforts at combating the spread to go higher, like a state of emergency is basically being asked in that department. And you're also asking that Ebola be classified as high risks in comparison with crisis in Syria and other nations where there are terrorism. Speak to me on what measures or what responses organizations like yours are getting from governments internally.
It's tough because, you know, again, we don't see the risk. We don't understand that all it takes is for one person to enter our borders and then the thing will spread. And, you know, how are we planning to be able to detect those cases, quarantine people, isolate them, and then treat them? Because it's not just to put people aside, it's also to provide the care and the treatment. Are our doctors ready? Are they prepared? Are they trained? Those are the questions we have to ask.
Now, Niniola, in a nation like DRC that we're talking about specifically this morning, it has gotten to a stage where health workers and volunteers are now reported to be afraid to put on their protective gears and uniform so as not to be seen or identified with trying to assist organizations like maybe the Red Cross and other health volunteers across the world to curb Ebola. Because once they put on the uniform, insurgents and terrorists identify them and then basically go for them. What are the issues? Why do you think that insecurity now is being tied to, why would you want to use Ebola epidemic, efforts at curtailing Ebola epidemic as a measure of war?
So from the people's perspective, they feel that Ebola is actually a man-made thing that has been introduced into their societies and their communities to suppress them. And I think one of the things that has fueled that is the fact that the Ebola-affected communities were not allowed to participate in the past election. And so they feel as though, okay, you people came and put this thing here, made us sick, so that we can't vote and express ourselves. So I think it's very political. There's so many undertones to this epidemic, and that's why it's 10 months down the line and we're not seeing any end in sight.
So for them, it's been misconceived as a war against westernization. You're
Correct.
Interfering in our internal procedures. Are there measures that civil organizations or NGOs like yourself can use in mediating?
Yes, and that's a lot of the efforts that are trying to be done now, but it's difficult because even in engaging the influencers and the leaders in those rebel groups and in those communities, you're putting yourself at risk. In the last 2 months, 2 health workers trying to do this have died. So it's a very tough situation, and that's why more attention needs to be paid, more resources need to be put towards the effort to curb the outbreak.
So now at the moment, we have next Wednesday, NGOs like yourself sitting the Interagency Standing Committee, and they say they are actually calling for a system-wide scale-up. Now that's been regarded as a level 3 emergency, which is activated where there is what they call a mismatch between needs within a society or a country and the abilities of agencies to cater to the situation. Where do you see this heading?
Yeah, I think it's much needed. I think we're 10 months down the line, like I said, and we've seen that the tactics being used are not as effective as they could be, and things are still spiraling out of control. People are still dying from the violence, in addition to the disease itself. So it's time for everyone to come to the table and see what else we can do to really get this thing under control.
So talking about lax borders now, I'll take you back to that, where we have, from the land borders, almost zero checks at this point. It's like the conversation has moved on from 2014 at the airports. Now, this is not just limited to Nigeria, and I have seen it. You basically just get into the airports, you're checked, they check your bags. Nobody checks you for Ebola. It's like the conversation is dead.
Yeah.
So how are organizations like yourself or like the DRASA trying to reopen these conversations and maybe trying to draw the awareness of governments across Africa to the fact that this is still there, the body counts are rising, and the body counts at this point are being compared to terrorism, to deaths from internal terrorism within countries across Africa?
Yeah, I mean, essentially it's to engage government and explain to them the importance of this, as well as show them that it's not just about the fact that this thing can enter and kill people, it's also about the economy. We know that the economic losses for Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone in 2014 from Ebola were millions of dollars. And so if a country like Nigeria, for example, is affected by an outbreak, we just don't know how long it will take us to recover, not just socially, but also our economy. So it's trying to explain that to them in a way that they see the importance of prioritizing these issues.
Niniola, many thanks to you for your time and thought on the show this morning.